In this video I'm going to explain how you can create your own vehicle models, probe models and also animations for inclusion inside of Tornado Research and Rescue. So the first thing you'll have to do is download Unity and create a new project. So you can do that by clicking the new project button. It's important that you match the version of Unity to that used in the game. So you need to get 2021.3. I don't think the 0.17 matters as much. Just make sure you get the LTS version of 2021.3. Make sure it's a 3D project, just a core project. You don't need anything fancy like any of the scriptable render pipelines. And then give your project a name and then click Create Project. I've already got one created, which is the template project. So I'll load that up here. So we've got a blank Unity project here with just blank scene, camera, directional light, and you don't even really need these, to be honest. So to get the assets you need for modding the game, if you go to your game install folder, there'll be a folder called Unity Modding Project. Double click that and then there'll be this Unity package. If you double click that, it'll import everything you need for modding. So just make sure you've got all the animations, DLLs, editor scripts and so on, and click import. The next thing you'll want to do is go to Models, ModelParent, and click and drag this onto the hierarchy here. Then you need to make sure you make any changes in prefab mode. So to enter prefab mode, click this arrow here on the right hand side. So any changes you make will be applied to this file rather than just to your project, and that's important for the later steps which I'll outline in this video. So first I'm just going to go over everything. You can see this isn't a brilliant car. The idea is that I'm just given the bare bones template of what elements you need to develop a car, and then you can put much fancier, higher poly count models into the game. So I'm going to go over each of these game objects and explain what they do. So starting with model parent, it's important that you don't rename this, otherwise your vehicle won't load into the game. It looks specifically for that name. It has a deploy probe script that references an animator, which is just this here. This is essentially a controller which lets you trigger and stop certain animations. And then it's also got a reference to what's called a probe prefab, which is this ProbeHolder over here. There's also the custom vehicle references script. Now this is the most important script in the whole project. If this is configured incorrectly, your car won't work at all. So I'm going to go over each of these fields line by line. The first one is the initial rotation. When you develop your model, it'll line up along likely one of the axes, either the x-axis or the x-axis or the z-axis. And when you import it into the game, it expects it to be along a certain axis. So what can happen is, instead of this being your front left wheel and this being your front right wheel, when it gets imported, the game might think that this is your front left wheel and this is your front right wheel. So of course this makes a vehicle that's completely uncontrollable. So sometimes you need to rotate your model by 90 degrees in either direction, just so that it handles correctly in the game. So that's what this is for. You need to experiment with this, but it'll likely be 0, 90 or negative 90 degrees along the y-axis. Next, we've got the references to each of the wheel models. So we've got front left, front right, rear left, and rear right reference. It's important that you match the reference to the corresponding reference that's shown on the left-hand side here. When you configure your wheels, you need to know what each of the axes is for. The wheel is powered in the direction of the z-axis, so that's the blue arrow, so this points forward. The wheels will spin around the x-axis, which is the red arrow, and when you steer, they'll pivot around the y-axis. So sometimes when you build a model, it might be oriented differently. So, for example, we've got this wheel model here. If I don't apply any rotation to it, it's oriented like that. So to get it oriented correctly, it needs to be rotated 90 degrees along the z-axis, but now it's going to want to pivot along this axis here, and it's going to be powered along here, so the wheels are going to spin almost like a spinning top instead of along the correct axis. So to fix that, just create an empty parent. So you right click and say create empty. You don't need anything on this other than a transform. I'll just delete that because we've already got one here. And place it where you want the wheel to go, and then once you've got your wheel oriented correctly, you just click and drag that onto there, and you use the parent wheel object as the reference on this script. In that way, all of your wheels will be imported correctly in the correct orientation, and they'll pivot and spin in the correct directions. Next, you've got your colliders. So these are the wheel collider. These are the wheel collider components that come by default with Unity. The only thing you really need to worry about is the radius and making sure that they're in the same position as the actual wheels themselves. So just a simple trick for this, let's just move this over here. So if you want to align this with this wheel here, you can click on the wheel you want, click on the three dots here, copy position. Make sure you click position and not position world. Click on your collider, then go three dots, paste, position, and it'll align it exactly with your wheel model. You can see the wheel here, if we go to the actual model itself, has a diameter of 0.5 meters, which means the radius should be set to 1/4 meter here. So you can use this to match up your radius with the model. That assumes your model's got a 1-to-1 scale with the Unity world. You may need to experiment with this to get it perfectly lined up with your wheel. So once you've created your wheel colliders, you set those references here. The next thing we've got is the laptop screen. This is just a 2D canvas, and this is where the laptop screen will be rendered. So that's your radar, your mission screen, which is soon to be the market screen, and all the other in-game screens which you use. Now you may have this placed with your own custom laptop model. You may have it on the windscreen. You may put it in the center of the steering wheel or something crazy like that. Whatever you do with it, you just need to make sure that you've got a width of 320, a height of 180, and then you can just place it and make sure it's set to world space and just move this around as necessary so that it's aligned in the correct space. Once you've done that, simply click and drag your laptop screen to the laptop screen. And for all of these references, you can either click here and select them or click and drag. Next, we've got the headlights. So you've got the left light and the right light. These are spotlights, and you can customize the range and the color and intensity, and you can increase the angle if you want. So if you want it to cover more of the road ahead, you can customize that. So this is the actual light source itself, and this should be disabled by default. It'll be enabled when you hit L in game. We've also got a model here, and I've just got a basic cube. But if you set a material and enable a mission, what the game will do is when you turn the light on, it'll go from being darkened like that to brightened, so it creates the effect of the light being switched on. So I'll just undo that. But you've just got to make sure that you've got emission enabled and set it to a dark value so it doesn't already look illuminated. Once you set these references here for the left light and right light, make sure that the children of the actual model, so the light should be the child and the model should be the parent, the game will automatically illuminate the lights and enable them. Next, we've got the steering wheel. So we'll go to that. I've just got it set as a cube. Now the steering wheel pivots around the Z axis. So by default, the cube I had wasn't oriented like that. See, it's oriented like this. So using the same trick as before, create an empty game object with just a transform. Orient the transform to how you need it, and line it up with your wheel, and then just make your steering wheel model a child of that steering parent, and it'll then pivot as you steer the car. And then finally we've got the probe holder. This is of course your probe model. We've just created a basic cylinder and a cube on top, which is the light. I'll show you how to customize these in a moment. But this just needs to point to there so that the game, when it loads in, knows how to access your probe model along with the scripts and other animation components on it. These windscreen, GPU and LUTs will be used for the windscreen rain effects. They, however, need a little bit more work before they're ready to be modded. So they're included for future proofing, but these won't do anything here, so just keep these blank. So next we'll take a look at the probe. This is your mesh, so here I've just got a cylinder. This is what you'd replace with your own probe model. It's got a capsule collider. I'd suggest keeping your own collider on there just so it interacts correctly with other scene objects. It'll also need a collider so that the tornado can interact with it and you can record readings. There's also a probe controller script. Just make sure that it's set to inactive. You don't need to set the HUD profile or any of the probe positions. These are set automatically. and then it's got an animator on. So you've got an animator in your model parent called ModelParent, and you've got an animator on your ProbeHolder named ProbeHolder, and I'll explain these animations shortly. And here we've got a light source and a light model, much in the same way as we do for the car headlights, and these should be disabled by default. I've already explained laptop screen. Next we've got PlayerHead. This is where the camera position will be when you go into first person view in the vehicle. So you'll need to experiment with this to get it to give you a good view of both your laptop, the steering wheel, the road ahead, and also your speedometer. Next we've got a reduced mesh. What this is, this needs to be called reduced mesh, is a simplified version of your car's body. So for rendering you'll use like the high poly model of the car body, which will be detailed, but for calculating collisions you just need a simplified mesh, so you can create a low poly version of that, just a rough approximation. Add a mesh collider, make sure it's set as convex, then make sure you've got this pullable object script added. It should be set to active and it should be set as player vehicle, and then your vehicle will interact correctly with the tornado in the game. Next we've got PlayerEntry. This is a box collider. You don't need to have a rendered cube there, you can just set a box collider. So when you stand inside this box, the game will prompt you to enter the vehicle, so you can press E to enter the vehicle once you're standing inside that box. So just make sure that's near your driver's side door. You can play with the position and the scale. Just make sure it's sufficiently big so that you can easily access your vehicle. All these fields need to be left blank, except for muffle should point to the inside the My Custom Mixer and the muffle mixer, and then clear should be set to clear. What these are for is for when you climb into the car, the rain effects and other sound effects will be muffled slightly by using a low pass filter, or it might be a high pass filter, one of the two. And when you climb in the car, this will get enabled. When you get out of the car, this will be enabled. So it's just different audio mixers to create the effect of getting inside and outside of a car. You'll notice like the rain sounds louder when you climb outside of the car, and you can hear it clearer. Everything else can be left blank. These will be populated automatically. Next, you get your actual car model itself. So again, this is the mesh. This is what you'd replace with the model of your car. This doesn't have to be constrained to a single mesh. You can have it broken up into multiple objects if you want, just as long as the children of this Jeep J10 FBX game object, and it has to have this exact name as well, otherwise the model won't be loaded in the game. This doesn't have any scripts attached to it. Next we've got the TailgatePivot. This is so that when you deploy your probe, it will open correctly. So I believe it rotates around the x-axis. Yeah. So you set that so that it pivots around that point. If you imagine if the pivot's set somewhere different, let me just change that for a second, just to show what the point of this is. Let's just move this up here and then do that. It's going to pivot around that point, which doesn't look right on the truck. You want to set that pivot to exactly where the pivot point should be. So the left and right doesn't really matter, it's just got to be somewhere along the bottom edge of the tailgate and where the hinge would actually be. Again, parent that. Make sure that it's working correctly. So if we pivot along there, now it's working. Next we've got the speedometer. So this needs to have the speed updater script, and it will need a reference to your speed text here. So that is referencing that. I suggest keeping the template text in there just so you can make sure that's the right size. You can customize the font. This just comes with the default font with Unity, but you can just drag any font file into the project and reference that. Set your font size. You can set the centering and the color as well, and then this will be wired into the game. We've already discussed the lights, and we've discussed the steering. We've discussed the wheel models and the wheel colliders. So the last thing to discuss is the ProbeInteraction. So let's show where this is. So this is the area that you need to be standing to deploy the probe. And if you want to retrieve the probe, both you and the probe need to be inside this box. So you can set this box to whatever size you want. Just obviously make sure it's big enough for ease of access. And make sure the player probe inbound script is attached. Make sure it's got a box collider and it's set as trigger. So far what we've covered is which Unity version to use, which is 2021.3. How to import the project, and I've talked through each of the main components. So now the key thing is animations. So the animation in the game, the default one, it opens this tailgate, the probe slides along, swivels around and then gets lowered to the ground, then the tailgate flips back up again, and then loading it onto the truck. It's that same process but in reverse. However, when you customize the model, obviously your probe's going to be in a different position, it's going to need to be animated differently. So I'm going to start with the probe deployment animation. So to access that, you go to ModelParent, and then you've got this ModelParent animator. So if you double click on this, this will show you the state graph. Now this isn't going to be a tutorial on Unity animations. I highly recommend that you watch a few tutorials. It's not as difficult as it seems. But I'll just give a very high level overview. When you first start the game, you're in this entry state and you'll immediately go to this not moving state. There's no animation attached to this. The probe will just stay in the bed of the truck. Now the key thing here is that there's a trigger. So if we go to parameters, we've got 3 triggers. We've got start deployment, load to truck, and fast reset. You only really need to worry about the start deployment and load to truck. So when you press enter in the game, that'll fire this trigger saying start deployment, so you'll go from your not moving state to your tailgate deploy sequence. Now this is where the animation panel comes in useful. If you don't have this open, just go window, animation, animation, and it'll open up. So we'll do that. We'll put the scene view on here and we'll click on model parent. So this is the tailgate deploy sequence. If I just press play, we can watch it play out. So the tailgate's pivoted open, the probe's slid along to where it needs to be, it'll pivot, and then it'll be lowered to the ground. It will also suddenly disappear, so we'll see that here in a second. And then the tailgate closes, and then that's just going to keep looping. So the reason it disappears is that there's 2, you can think of as spaces or reference spaces that the model can exist in. So because this is a child of the car, if you were to make no other changes, when the probe's deployed and you drive around, it would just follow you behind your car. So what needs to happen is that the game makes a clone of the model and puts it in the exact same position as the animated version of the model, but then it hides the animated version of the model, and this is seamless, you won't see it in the game. So that's why here you can see the object's active, and then once you get to here, as soon as it hits the ground, the active checkbox is unchecked. At the same time that happens, it calls a script called make probe position global. What this does is it unparents it from the car and it sets a clone of your probe in world space so that where you can drive around and the probe will stay in the same place. So likely what you'll have to do is move this probe around and set it to a different position. So one thing I'd suggest you do is come out of the animations panel and place the probe, like replace this mesh with your probe model. You can have multiple smaller models as children of this ProbeHolder. Just make sure they're all children of ProbeHolder. Then set its position and its rotation. So as you can see here, it's got a position of minus 2.02, rotation of 90 degrees along the x-axis, and you can scale it as well. So in the animation, if we look at each of these, the tailgate hasn't pivoted. It's set to the same position as it was up here. So same position, same rotation. And the first thing that will happen is that the tailgate will pivot from being 0 degrees along the x-axis to minus 90. At the same time, the probe is going to move from a position of minus 2.02 along the z-axis to, let's just jump ahead to the next keyframe, to minus 3.8. So again, you have to experiment with this position and see how far it needs to slide in your model. Once it's reached that position, it will then pivot along one of these axes. I forget which it is. The x-axis. So yeah, so going from being rotated 90 degrees, it'll then go to being rotated 0 degrees by the next keyframe. Finally, it'll be lowered to the ground, so you can see the Y position decreasing here. And when it hits the ground, it's important that it's set to inactive and that the probe position global script is called. Finally, the tailgate will pivot back into position. So you can customize, you don't have to necessarily stick to this template, just this is provided for your convenience. You can create your own complicated animation. So if you wanted to have a probe that spins on all 3 axes as it's deployed and you have 4 different types of tailgates and other contraptions up here which open up in some sort of cool way, you can do that, but this is how it works in the base game. You can use this as a starting point for your own animations. Next we've got the deploy static sequence. This literally just keeps the probe in the same position as it was when you started animating. So once it's reached the ground, it'll just stay in that position. This is just needed so that nothing happens to the probe until you decide to load it back onto the truck. Again, just make sure your positions and rotations match the same as when it's fully deployed. Then we've got the load on truck sequence. This is essentially the deployment sequence in reverse. However, there's a few differences. At the beginning, you need to trigger this remove probe for truck loading script, and then once it's been loaded, you need to call this finish loading probe on truck. This just triggers the game so that it knows that the probe's in the truck and that it can be deployed, and it makes the state of the game consistent with the state of your animation. And that's important, otherwise your probe could be outside of the vehicle, but the game thinks that it's still in the vehicle and asks you to deploy it twice, and it could cause all sorts of consistency issues. So again, customize this as much as you want. Just make sure that those scripts are called at the beginning and end. Next, we've got the animations on the probe itself. These are fairly straightforward, and I'll just show the animator. So if we open the animator for this is the ProbeHolder animation. Again, it goes immediately to the lights off animation, which is no animation, just nothing will happen, it'll sit there static. But we do have two triggers, lights on and lights off. Lights on simply makes you go into the lights on state, and lights off makes you go into the lights off state. So let's take a look at this animation here. What this does is when you trigger lights on, it'll set the emission values on this material. So this is just a light model with a simple, it's got straightforward material added there. Make sure it's got emission enabled, and then that'll create the illusion of the light lighting up. Next, the light source will be enabled. So you can see there the spotlight shining there. And then we've also got the rotation, so it'll spin through 360 degrees. Again, feel free to customize this. You can change the color. You can even change the number of lights. Just any lights you add need to be added into this animation panel. And then you'll be able to see the light spinning around and activated in the game. So feel free to be as creative as you want with that. Once you've finished building your model, what you want to do is click Assets and Build Asset Bundles. This will take a little bit of time. This will be output to your mods, vehicles, and it'll create a bunch of scripts here. If you right click and click Show in Explorer, you'll have a bunch of files. All you need is the loadable vehicle file. All the others can be ignored. So to put this in the game, what you first want to do is give it a name. So let's just call it template truck. Then want to go back to your install directory, go to your data folder, streaming assets, mods, vehicles, and then you can copy and paste it into there. Now when you load up the game, the main menu, you'll be asked to select your truck. So one will be loadable vehicle, this will be the default truck in the game, and then you've got your own truck there. You can add as many of these as you'd like. And that's about everything that I've got to show for the moddable vehicles and probes. If you have any questions, feel free to ask either on the community on the Steam page. However, I am more active on the Discord, so if you join the Discord, I can help more quickly. I will update this tutorial with I guess an additional video on how to wire in the windscreen rain effects once those are ready. But for now, have fun modding the game, and I can't wait to see what all you guys come up with.